The fluorescent lights of the upscale Manhattan restaurant buzzed overhead as Sarah Martinez wiped down the stainless steel prep counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening. Her calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, but she couldn't ignore the snickers coming from the dining room staff who had gathered near the kitchen's pass window. "Look at those arms," whispered Jessica, the head hostess, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's like she's been through a war zone or something. How does management let someone looking like that work in a place like this?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her focus on her work. The scars they were mocking told a story of burns from hot oil, cuts from razor-sharp knives, and the countless battles fought in professional kitchens across 3 different states. Each mark was a badge of honor earned through years of dedication to her craft. But to the pristine waitstaff of Bernardin's rival restaurant, Coastal Elite, they were nothing more than unsightly blemishes that didn't belong in their world of polished appearances and pretentious atmospheres. "I heard she worked at some dive places before coming here," added Marcus, a server who'd been hired straight out of culinary school without ever having worked a real shift in his life. "Probably got those scars from working in greasy diners and food trucks. I don't know why Chef Rodriguez even hired her." The cruel laughter that followed made Sarah's stomach churn, but she'd heard worse, much worse. During her 8 years in the Navy, she'd endured things that would break most people, and she'd learned to compartmentalize pain, both physical and emotional. These spoiled restaurant workers had no idea what real adversity looked like. Chef Rodriguez, the head chef and owner, had hired Sarah 3 months ago after tasting her signature lobster bisque during a grueling 12-hour trial shift. He'd been impressed not just by her culinary skills, but by her work ethic and the quiet intensity she brought to every dish. However, he spent most of his time in his office handling the business side of operations, leaving the day-to-day kitchen dynamics to sort themselves out. This had created a toxic environment where the front-of-house staff, led by Jessica and Marcus, felt empowered to make Sarah's life miserable. They'd accidentally forget to relay special dietary requests to the kitchen, causing Sarah to have to remake dishes at the last minute. They'd spread rumors about her past, making up stories about failed restaurants and health code violations. Worst of all, they'd openly mock her appearance whenever they thought she couldn't hear. "Maybe she should consider long sleeves," suggested Brittany, another server who'd never worked anywhere that didn't have valet parking. Customers can see into the kitchen from some tables. It's kind of gross. Sarah's grip tightened on the sanitizing cloth she was holding. The scars they were ridiculing represented 15 years of professional cooking, starting when she was just 18 and working her way through community college. The burn on her left forearm came from a New Year's Eve rush at a busy steakhouse in Texas, where she'd reached over a flaming grill to plate the last order of the night. The series of small cuts along her knuckles were from her early days learning proper knife technique, when she'd practiced julienning vegetables until her fingers bled. But there were other scars too, ones that had nothing to do with cooking. The faint line across her right shoulder blade was from shrapnel during her second deployment in Afghanistan. The barely visible mark on her neck was from a training accident during Hell Week, when she'd pushed herself beyond what most people thought possible for someone her size. These were the scars that had shaped her into the person she was today, resilient, focused, and absolutely unbreakable. "I bet she doesn't even have formal training," Marcus continued, warming to his theme. "Probably learned everything from YouTube videos and thinks she can hang with real chefs. If only they knew." Sarah had trained under James Beard Award winners, had worked in Michelin-starred restaurants in San Francisco and Chicago during her leave periods, and had once cooked for a 4-star general and his staff during a diplomatic dinner in Kabul. Her knife skills were so precise that she could break down a whole chicken in under 2 minutes. And her palate was so refined that she could identify individual spices and complex sauces with just a single taste. But none of that mattered to her tormentors. All they saw were the visible reminders of a life lived fully, risks taken, and challenges overcome. To them, she was an outsider who didn't fit their image of what a high-end restaurant employee should look like. The worst part wasn't the comments themselves. Sarah had endured far worse during her military service. It was the effect this toxic environment was having on her passion for cooking. For the first time in years, she'd started dreading coming to work. The joy she felt when creating a perfect sauce or nailing a complex technique was being overshadowed by the constant need to defend her place in the kitchen where she was clearly not welcome. As the evening shift continued, the mockery persisted, growing bolder and more cruel with each passing hour. Little did they know that their target was about to show them exactly what real strength looked like. The next evening brought no relief for Sarah. If anything, the harassment had intensified. Word had spread among the entire front-of-house staff about the scarred cook, and what had started as whispered comments had evolved into open ridicule. "I heard from my friend at 11 Madison Park that they would never hire someone who looks like that," announced Trevor, the sommelier, as he polished wine glasses near the kitchen entrance. "Image is everything in fine dining. Customers pay premium prices for the complete experience, and that includes having staff who look the part." Sarah focused on preparing the evening's amuse-bouche, a delicate construction of seared scallops with cauliflower puree and microgreens. Her hands moved with military precision, each movement economical and purposeful. Years of training had taught her to block out distractions, but the constant stream of comments was beginning to wear on even her considerable reserves of patience. "Maybe she should look into makeup," suggested Amy, a server who'd been hired primarily for her Instagram following rather than her restaurant experience. "I know this great concealer that could probably cover most of those marks. I could give her the name of my esthetician too. They do chemical peels that might help with the texture." The other servers laughed at Amy's suggestion, apparently finding the idea of Sarah attempting to improve her appearance hilarious. They had no idea that she'd once been selected for a joint operation with British SAS forces, specifically because of her ability to blend into hostile environments. Her unprofessional appearance was actually the result of years spent in situations where looking polished and pristine was not just impossible, but potentially fatal. Chef Rodriguez emerged from his office just as the laughter reached its peak. "What's so funny out here?" he asked, his thick accent carrying a note of irritation. The restaurant was entering its busy period, and he needed his staff focused on service, not whatever gossip was entertaining them. "Oh, nothing, chef," Jessica replied quickly, shooting a meaningful glance at the others. "Just discussing some menu suggestions." Rodriguez nodded curtly and returned to his office, missing the renewed snickering that followed his departure. Sarah caught his eye for just a moment, and she thought she saw a flicker of concern there, but he was gone before she could be sure. The evening rush began in earnest, and Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. She was responsible for the protein station, handling the restaurant's signature dry-aged steaks and fresh seafood selections. Each dish had to be perfect. The restaurant's reputation depended on it, and Sarah's professional pride wouldn't accept anything less. "Order up," she called, sliding a perfectly cooked piece of halibut across the pass. But instead of the usual acknowledgement, she was met with a deliberate delay as Marcus slowly finished a conversation with another server before reluctantly collecting the plate. "This is taking forever to get out," he announced loudly. "Maybe if the kitchen could work a little faster, our customers wouldn't have to wait so long." It was a blatant lie. Sarah's ticket times were consistently the fastest in the kitchen, a skill honed by years of cooking under pressure in field conditions, where delays could mean the difference between life and death. But the accusation served its purpose. Several other staff members nodded in agreement, adding their own criticisms of the kitchen's supposed inefficiency. The sabotage escalated throughout the evening. Servers would claim they hadn't heard Sarah call out completed orders, forcing dishes to sit under heat lamps until they were overcooked. They'd request modifications to dishes at the last possible moment, claiming customers had allergies that hadn't been mentioned before. Most cruelly, they'd loudly discuss fictional customer complaints about seeing that scarred cook through the kitchen's viewing window. Table 12 said they lost their appetite when they saw her arms, Brittany announced, though Sarah was certain no such complaint had been made. Maybe she should work the back prep area where customers can't see her. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and relentless. These people had clearly perfected the art of workplace bullying, using their numbers and social cohesion to isolate and torment anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. They attacked her appearance, questioned her competence, and tried to undermine her confidence at every turn. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. Sarah Martinez wasn't some fresh culinary school graduate who could be easily broken. She was a decorated Navy SEAL who had completed one of the most challenging training programs in the world, had served 3 combat deployments, and had earned the respect of some of the toughest warriors on the planet. Their petty cruelty was nothing compared to what she'd already survived. As the evening wound down and the last orders were sent out, Sarah began her closing routine with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. She cleaned each station thoroughly, organized the walk-in cooler, and prepared the prep list for the next day's morning shift. The harassment continued around her, but she could feel something building inside her, not anger exactly, but a cold determination that her tormentors were about to understand the difference between appearing tough and actually being tough. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything, and Sarah was ready to show these spoiled restaurant workers what real strength looked like. By the 3rd week of constant harassment, the situation at Coastal Elite had reached a breaking point. What had started as casual mockery had evolved into systematic psychological torture, orchestrated by a group of servers who seemed to take genuine pleasure in making Sarah's life miserable. The campaign against her had become increasingly sophisticated and personal. Jessica had started a group chat called Kitchen Watch, where staff members would share photos and videos mocking Sarah's scars, often adding crude captions and filters. Marcus had begun timing her movements and reporting fictional inefficiencies to anyone who would listen. Even the newer servers, who might have otherwise been neutral, were being pressured to participate in the harassment or risk becoming targets themselves. "I think she's getting the message," Jessica said during the pre-shift meeting, her voice carrying false concern. "Maybe if we keep this up, she realized she'd be happier somewhere more appropriate for her situation." The cruelty had reached such a level that even some of the kitchen staff were beginning to participate. The young line cooks, eager to fit in with the seemingly popular front-of-house crowd, had started making their own comments. Only Diego, the elderly prep cook who'd worked in restaurants for 40 years, remained neutral, though Sarah could see the sympathy in his eyes whenever their paths crossed. But the harassment had an unexpected consequence. Instead of breaking Sarah down, it was stripping away the civilian persona she'd carefully constructed since leaving the military. The patient, accommodating cook who'd been trying to fit into this upscale restaurant environment was being replaced by someone much more familiar, the warrior who'd earned her place among the most elite fighters in the world. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Her posture became more erect, her movements more precise and economical. When she spoke, which was rarely, her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than kitchen experience. Most tellingly, she'd stopped trying to hide the small tattoo on her inner wrist, a tattoo that would soon change everything. The pivotal moment came on a busy Friday evening when the restaurant was packed with New York's social elite. Food critics, celebrities, and wealthy business executives filled every table, creating the kind of high-pressure environment where mistakes could cost careers and reputations. Sarah was working her station with machine-like efficiency, turning out perfect plates despite the constant stream of harassment from the waitstaff. She developed a rhythm that allowed her to block out the noise and focus entirely on her craft, a skill that had served her well in much more dangerous situations. "I still can't believe management allows her to work here," Trevor announced loudly enough for several customers to hear. "My cousin works at Daniel, and they would never tolerate someone who looks like she's been through a blender." This time, however, Trevor had miscalculated. At a nearby table sat Colonel James Morrison, recently retired from the Army Special Forces, who was dining with his wife to celebrate their anniversary. The colonel's trained ear had picked up something in the servers' conversation that made him pay closer attention to the woman they were mocking. He couldn't see her clearly from his angle, but there was something about her posture and movement that triggered his professional instincts. The way she held herself, the economic precision of her movements, the calm focus she maintained despite obvious stress, these were characteristics he'd seen before, in very specific circumstances. "Honey, I need to use the restroom," he told his wife, but instead of heading toward the facilities, he took a detour that brought him closer to the kitchen's viewing area. What he saw there made him stop in his tracks. The woman working the protein station moved with a level of discipline and precision that was unmistakably military. But it was more than that. The particular way she handled her tools, the spatial awareness she demonstrated even in the cramped kitchen, and most importantly, the small tattoo visible on her inner wrist when she reached for a plate. Colonel Morrison had seen that exact tattoo before, on the wrists of some of the most elite warriors he'd ever had the privilege to work with. It was simple, subtle, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But to those in the know, it was as clear as a neon sign. Meanwhile, the harassment was reaching new heights. Jessica had convinced several servers to join her in a coordinated effort to humiliate Sarah in front of the packed dining room. They'd planned to stage a fake incident where they'd loudly complain about her appearance in front of customers, hoping to force management to finally take action. "This is it," Jessica whispered to her co-conspirators. "After tonight, she'll be gone, and we can get back to having a staff that actually represents this restaurant's standards." They had no idea they were about to pick a fight with someone who'd spent years training for combat against much more dangerous enemies than a group of entitled restaurant workers. The woman they'd been tormenting for weeks was about to remind them that appearances could be very, very deceiving. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just Sarah's true identity, but the character or lack thereof of everyone involved. In a matter of minutes, the quiet cook they'd been bullying would reveal herself to be someone far more formidable than any of them had imagined, and their comfortable world of casual cruelty was about to be shattered forever. Jessica's plan was as cruel as it was calculated. She'd spent the entire week coordinating with her fellow servers to orchestrate what she called the final solution to their Sarah problem. The scheme was designed to publicly humiliate Sarah in front of the restaurant's most important customers, forcing Chef Rodriguez to finally take action against the woman they'd decided didn't belong in their upscale establishment. "Remember, we need witnesses," Jessica instructed her conspirators during their pre-shift huddle. "Mrs. Patterson from the Times food section is table 7, and that tech billionaire who owns half of Soho is at table 12. If we do this right, word will spread that this place employs people who don't meet the standards expected in fine dining." Marcus nodded eagerly, his eyes bright with malicious anticipation. "I've already primed a few of the kitchen guys. They're ready to back us up when we say she's been contaminating food with her ... conditions." It was a vicious lie, of course. Sarah maintained the highest standards of cleanliness and food safety, often exceeding the protocols that the restaurant required. Her military training had instilled in her an almost obsessive attention to detail when it came to hygiene and contamination prevention. But Jessica's group was counting on the fact that most customers would rather err on the side of caution when it came to their food safety. The plan was to wait until the peak of the dinner rush, when the kitchen was at its most visible and the fuzzy dining room was full of influential patrons. Then Jessica would loudly discover that Sarah had been handling food with open wounds, demanding that management immediately remove her from the kitchen for health code violations. What Jessica and her accomplices didn't know was that their target had been aware of their plotting from the beginning. Years of operating in hostile territory had honed Sarah's situational awareness to an almost supernatural degree. She'd noticed the increased whispering, the meaningful glances, and the way certain staff members had started positioning themselves for optimal viewing angles of her station. More importantly, she'd overheard enough fragments of conversation to piece together their plan. In the military, intelligence gathering was often a matter of life and death, and Sarah had learned to pick up on threats long before they materialized into action. These amateur conspirators were about as subtle as a marching band, but Sarah wasn't just aware of the plot, she was ready for it. The constant harassment had finally pushed her past the point of simply enduring. These people wanted to see what she was really made of. They were about to get their wish, though not in the way they expected. Meanwhile, Colonel Morrison had returned to his table, but his attention remained focused on the kitchen. He'd managed to get a clearer look at Sarah's tattoo, and his suspicions were now confirmed. The woman being tormented by this restaurant staff was a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the American military. "Everything all right, dear?" his wife asked, noticing his distraction. "I'm not sure," the colonel replied carefully. "I think we might be about to witness something interesting." His combat experience had taught him to recognize the signs of an approaching confrontation, and every instinct he'd developed over 30 years of military service was telling him that the situation in this kitchen was about to explode. Question wasn't whether something would happen, but how devastating it would be when it did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The dinner rush reached its peak at exactly 8:30 p.m., just as Jessica had planned. Every table was occupied. The noise level was high enough to ensure that any commotion would be noticed, and the kitchen was operating at maximum visibility. Perfect conditions for public humiliation. Jessica exchanged a meaningful look with Marcus and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. It was time. "Oh my God," Marcus suddenly exclaimed, his voice pitched to carry across the dining room. Chef Rodriguez, you need to see this immediately." The sudden outburst caused conversations to pause throughout the restaurant. Heads turned toward the kitchen as Marcus pointed dramatically at Sarah's station, his face a mask of fake horror and concern. "She's been handling food with open wounds," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "Look at her arms. Those cuts and burns are contaminating everything she touches." A collective gasp arose from several nearby tables. In the world of high-end dining, food safety concerns were the equivalent of shouting "fire" in a crowded theater. Customers began pushing back from their tables, some standing up to get a better look at the accused cook. Chef Rodriguez burst through his office door, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "What the hell is going on out here?" he demanded. Jessica stepped forward, playing her role to perfection. "Chef, I'm so sorry, but we can't in good conscience allow this to continue. That woman," she pointed directly at Sarah, "has been preparing food with visible wounds all over her arms. Our customers deserve better than this health code violation." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Every eye in the restaurant was now focused on Sarah, who stood calmly at her station, a perfectly plated piece of salmon in her hands. For a moment, The only sound was the gentle sizzle of pans on the stove. Then Sarah Martinez did something that no one expected. She smiled. The smile that crossed Sarah's face wasn't one of embarrassment or defeat. It was the cold, predatory smile of a warrior who had just been given permission to stop pretending to be something she wasn't. For weeks, she'd played the role of the quiet, accommodating cook, absorbing their abuse while maintaining the professional demeanor expected in a civilian workplace. But they just crossed a line that changed everything. Health code violations? Sarah repeated, her voice carrying a tone that made several people in the dining room unconsciously straighten up. There was something in that voice, a quiet authority, that spoke of command experience and absolute confidence. She set down the salmon plate with deliberate precision and stepped out from behind her station, moving into full view of the packed dining room. The overhead lights illuminated every scar on her arms as she slowly rolled up her sleeves, displaying the marks that had been the source of so much mockery. "These scars," she said, her voice now carrying clearly across the suddenly silent restaurant, "represent 15 years of professional cooking. Every burn, every cut, every mark tells the story of a woman who has dedicated her life to perfecting her craft." Jessica tried to interrupt, sensing that something was going very wrong with her carefully planned humiliation. "That's not the point. I'm not finished," Sarah cut her off, and the steel in her voice made Jessica take an involuntary step backward. "You want to talk about health code violations? Let me tell you about real health codes. In Afghanistan, I ran field kitchens that fed hundreds of soldiers daily, often under enemy fire, with supply lines that were constantly under threat. I maintained perfect food safety standards in 120-degree heat, with limited water, while mortar rounds were exploding a quarter-mile away. The restaurant had become so quiet that the only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic outside. Every customer, every staff member, even Chef Rodriguez stood transfixed as this woman they'd been dismissing revealed something none of them had expected. "These burns on my forearms?" Sarah continued, pointing to specific scars. "That's from pulling a flaming pot off a propane burner during a rocket attack in Kandahar. I could have let our unit go hungry that night, but I didn't. These cuts on my hands? From preparing fresh vegetables with field knives in a forward operating base where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride through hostile territory." Colonel Morrison leaned forward in his seat, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd suspected what was coming, but watching it unfold was still impressive. This woman wasn't just defending herself, she was systematically dismantling her tormentors with surgical precision. "But you know what the most interesting thing is?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to strain to hear her. "You've all been so focused on these visible scars that you completely missed the important one." With deliberate slowness, she raised her right hand and pushed back the sleeve of her chef's coat, revealing the small, seemingly innocuous tattoo on her inner wrist. To most people in the restaurant, it looked like nothing more than a simple geometric design. But to those who knew what to look for, it was as clear as a neon sign. Colonel Morrison whispered a single word under his breath: "Trident, the Navy." Seal Trident tattoo was small, subtle, and deliberately understated. It wasn't the kind of flashy military ink that some veterans wore like billboards. This was the mark of someone who didn't need to advertise her credentials, because the people who mattered would recognize it immediately. "I am a United States Navy SEAL," Sarah announced, her voice now filling the restaurant with unmistakable authority. "I have completed 3 combat deployments, survived Hell Week, and earned the right to wear this trident. I have been shot at, bombed, and have had to make life and death decisions that most of you can't even imagine." The effect of this revelation was immediate and devastating. Jessica's face went white as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. Marcus actually took several steps backward, as if physical distance could somehow protect him from the consequences of his actions. The other servers who had participated in the harassment campaign looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor, but Sarah wasn't done. Years of suppressed frustration and controlled anger were finally finding their outlet, and she intended to make the most of it. "You want to know about contamination?" she continued, her eyes sweeping across the group of servers who had made her life hell. "I'll tell you about contamination. For 3 weeks, I have watched you handle food with unwashed hands after touching your phones, your faces, and God knows what else. I've seen you drop garnishes on the floor and put them back on plates. I've watched you ignore basic food safety protocols while pointing fingers at someone who has maintained higher standards than this restaurant requires." Chef Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally found his voice. "Sarah, I had no idea. Your background, your service ... Why would you?" Sarah replied, her tone softening slightly when addressing the one person in the restaurant who had treated her with professional respect. "I came here to cook, not to wave around my military credentials. I thought I could just do my job and earn respect through my work. I was wrong." The dining room remained in stunned silence as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. The quiet cook they'd been tormenting had revealed herself to be one of the most elite warriors in the American military, and the implications of that revelation were still sinking in. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The entire restaurant seemed frozen in time, with wealthy diners, influential food critics, and the staff all processing the bombshell that had just exploded in their midst. The woman they'd been dismissing as some scarred line cook from a dive restaurant had just revealed herself to be a decorated Navy SEAL. Jessica was the first to attempt damage control, though her voice shook with barely concealed panic. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We were just concerned about—" "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through Jessica's words like a blade. "There's no misunderstanding. For 3 weeks you have systematically harassed, humiliated, and attempted to destroy someone based purely on their appearance. You made assumptions about my background, my competence, and my worth as a human being without knowing the first thing about who I am or what I've accomplished." She began walking slowly toward the group of servers, and despite the fact that she was significantly smaller than most of them, every single one took a step backward. There was something in her bearing now, a predatory confidence that spoke of someone who had faced down much more dangerous enemies than a collection of spoiled restaurant workers. "You want to talk about standards?" Sarah continued, her eyes fixed on Jessica. "Let me tell you about standards. In the Navy SEALs, we have a saying, 'The only easy day was yesterday.' Every single day, we push ourselves beyond what normal people think is possible. We train until we break, and then we keep training. We face down enemies who want to kill us, and we do it with honor, courage, and commitment." Colonel Morrison stood up from his table, his movement causing several heads to turn in his direction. The distinguished older man walked deliberately toward the kitchen area, his military bearing unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Sarah directly, "Colonel James Morrison, Army Special Forces retired. I want to thank you for your service." The simple gesture carried enormous weight in the tense atmosphere of the restaurant. Here was another decorated military officer, publicly acknowledging and respecting Sarah's credentials in front of everyone who had been mocking her. Sarah straightened slightly and nodded. "Thank you, sir. It was an honor to serve." The exchange between two warriors created a stark contrast that wasn't lost on anyone present. While the restaurant staff had been focused on petty social hierarchies and superficial appearances, they had completely failed to recognize the genuine honor and sacrifice represented by the woman they'd been tormenting. Chef Rodriguez finally stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I should have been more aware of what was happening to you in my kitchen. This behavior is completely unacceptable." He turned to face the group of servers, his voice rising with genuine fury. "Jessica, Marcus, all of you, I am disgusted by what I've witnessed here tonight. You have disrespected not only a member of our team, but a woman who has served our country with distinction." Jessica tried one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Chef, you have to understand, we were just trying to maintain the restaurant's image. In fine dining, appearance matters, and—" "Stop," Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried such authority that Jessica immediately fell silent. "You keep talking about image and standards, but you have no idea what either of those words actually mean." Sarah moved to stand directly in front of Jessica, close enough that the hostess had to look up to meet her eyes. "Real standards aren't about having perfect skin or wearing designer clothes. Real standards are about integrity, courage, and the willingness to do what's right even when it's difficult. Real standards are about earning respect through your actions, not demanding it because of your appearance." The psychological dominance was complete. Jessica, who had been the ringleader of the harassment campaign, now looked like a scolded child facing down an adult who had caught her in a serious transgression. "You know what the most pathetic part of all this is?" Sarah continued, her voice now carrying a note of genuine disgust. "You could have learned something from me. I've worked in some of the best kitchens in the world. I've trained under James Beard Award winners. I've cooked for heads of state and military commanders. I could have taught you things about cooking, about professionalism, about what it really means to serve others. Instead, you chose to focus on scars." She gestured to her arms, but now the scars looked different to everyone watching. Instead of unsightly blemishes, they appeared as what they truly were, the marks of someone who had lived a life of service, sacrifice, and dedication to excellence. "These scars represent a life fully lived," Sarah said, her voice rising with passion. "They represent moments when I chose to put others before myself, when I risked my safety to accomplish the mission, when I refused to quit even when everything seemed impossible. What do your perfect, unmarked arms represent? What have you ever sacrificed for something greater than yourself?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and it was clear from the expressions on the servers' faces that they had no answer. Their world of superficial concerns and petty cruelties had just been exposed as exactly what it was: empty, meaningless, and ultimately cowardly. The reckoning was only beginning. And everyone in that restaurant was about to learn a lesson about the difference between appearing important and actually being important. Part 7. The Tables Turn. 800 to 1,000 words. The psychological shift in the restaurant was almost tangible. What had begun as an attempt to publicly humiliate Sarah had transformed into a masterclass in dignity, honor, and the difference between true strength and manufactured superiority. The very people who had been pointing fingers at her scars now found themselves exposed as shallow, petty individuals who had completely misjudged the person they'd been, tormenting Mrs. Patterson from the Times. Food section had been discreetly recording the entire confrontation on her phone. As a veteran food critic, she'd seen plenty of kitchen drama over the years, but nothing quite like this. The story unfolding before her had all the elements of a piece that would resonate far beyond the culinary world. It was about respect, service, and the dangerous assumptions we make about people based on appearances. The tech billionaire at table 12, Michael Chen, had also been watching with intense interest. As someone who had built his fortune by recognizing talent that others overlooked, he understood immediately what the restaurant's staff had failed to grasp. They had been bullying someone whose resume was more impressive than all of theirs combined. "You know what I find most interesting about this situation?" Sarah continued, her voice now carrying the calm authority of someone completely in control. "Not one of you ever bothered to ask about my background. You saw scars and immediately assumed incompetence, unprofessionalism, maybe even poverty. You never considered that those marks might represent something honorable. She moved closer to Marcus, who had been one of her most vocal critics. You specifically said I probably learned cooking from YouTube and dive restaurants. Would you like to know where I actually trained? Marcus tried to maintain his composure, but his voice cracked slightly when he answered. Where? Le Bernardin, during my leave time between deployments. Chef Eric Rapert personally mentored me for 6 months. I also spent time at 11 Madison Park, the French Laundry, and Alinea. Each of those chefs wrote recommendation letters that helped me secure positions at forward operating bases where I was responsible for maintaining morale through exceptional food service under combat conditions. The revelation hit like a series of precision strikes. These weren't just famous restaurants, they were temples of culinary excellence, places where most chefs could only dream of working. Sarah hadn't just worked there. She'd been personally trained by some of the most respected names in the industry. But surely, Jessica tried weakly, that doesn't excuse the health code. Health codes? Sarah's laugh was sharp and cutting. I hold certifications in food safety that most of you have never heard of. I'm trained in battlefield food service protocols that exceed civilian standards by orders of magnitude. When you're feeding troops in a war zone, contamination isn't just about getting someone sick, it can compromise an entire mission. Chef Rodriguez stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. Sarah, if I had known about your background, your training, with respect. Chef, Sarah interrupted. That's exactly the problem. My qualifications should have been evident in my work, not in my resume. For 3 months, I've consistently delivered perfect dishes, maintained impeccable stations, and exceeded every standard you set. But none of that mattered because of how I looked. The indictment was devastating in its simplicity. Sarah had proven herself through her performance every single day, but the staff had been too blinded by superficial prejudices to notice. They'd been so focused on her scars that they'd completely missed her exceptional skills. Diego, the elderly prep cook who had remained neutral throughout the harassment campaign, finally spoke up. She's right, he said quietly, his accented English carrying the weight of 4 decades in professional kitchens. I've worked with a lot of cooks, and she's one of the best I've ever seen. Her knife work, her timing, her palate, it's exceptional. But you were all too busy making jokes to pay attention. His testimony carried particular weight because Diego was universally respected in the kitchen. He'd seen generations of cooks come and go, and his assessment was considered the gold standard for evaluating talent. Colonel Morrison, who had been observing the proceedings with professional interest, decided to add his own perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, addressing the dining room, what you've witnessed tonight is a perfect example of why our military is the finest in the world. This woman represents the kind of character, integrity, and excellence that makes America great. He turned to face Sarah directly. Ma'am, your conduct tonight has been exemplary. You've shown restraint, dignity, and grace under pressure that would make any commanding officer proud. The contrast was stark and unmistakable. Here were 2 decorated military officers, recognizing and respecting each other's service, while the restaurant staff who had been so concerned about standards revealed themselves to have none whatsoever. Several customers began approaching Sarah, wanting to shake her hand and thank her for her service. The tech billionaire was among them, pulling out his business card as he walked over. Ms. Martinez, Michael Chun said, I'd like to speak with you about some opportunities in my organization. We're always looking for people with your kind of leadership experience and attention to excellence. The tables had completely turned. The woman they'd tried to drive out was now being courted by some of the most successful people in the restaurant, while her tormentors stood exposed as the small-minded bullies they truly were. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. She had one more lesson to teach. Sarah looked around the restaurant, taking in the faces of the customers who were now regarding her with respect and admiration, and the staff members who seemed to shrink under her gaze. This was her moment, not just to defend herself, but to teach a lesson that might prevent others from experiencing what she had endured. "You know," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent dining room, "in the military, we have a concept called leading by example. It means that your actions speak louder than your rank, your words, or your appearance. It means earning respect through your conduct, not demanding it through intimidation or social pressure." She gestured toward the group of servers who had orchestrated her harassment. "What I've experienced here over the past 3 weeks is the exact opposite of leadership. It's what we call toxic leadership, using position and group dynamics to tear down others rather than building them up." Jessica, who still seemed to be processing how completely her plan had backfired, made one last attempt to deflect responsibility. "We were just trying to maintain professional standards." "No," Sarah cut her off firmly. "You were engaging in workplace bullying, pure and simple. And the most pathetic part is that you convinced yourselves it was justified because I didn't fit your narrow definition of what a restaurant employee should look like." She walked over to the prep station where Diego was working and picked up one of the knives from his station. The movement was so fluid and natural that several people gasped, not from fear, but from the obvious expertise with which she handled the blade. "This is a Wusthof Classic 8-inch chef's knife," she said, examining the blade with professional appreciation. "In the wrong hands, it's just a tool. In the right hands, it becomes an extension of your will, capable of creating art from raw ingredients." With lightning-fast precision, she began breaking down a whole chicken that had been sitting on the prep counter. Her movements were so fast and precise that the bird was completely portioned in under 90 seconds, each piece cut with surgical accuracy. "Skill isn't about appearance," she continued as she worked, never slowing her pace or losing focus. "It's about training, dedication, and the willingness to push yourself beyond your comfort zone every single day. These scars on my hands, they represent thousands of hours of practice, learning from mistakes, and refusing to accept anything less than perfection." The demonstration was mesmerizing. Even the most experienced cooks in the restaurant were impressed by the speed and precision of her knife work. This wasn't just competence. This was artistry born from years of disciplined practice. "In the SEALs, we have another saying, 2 is 1, and 1 is none," Sarah continued, seamlessly moving from the chicken to julienning vegetables with the same effortless precision. "It means always having a backup plan, always being prepared for the unexpected. But it also means looking out for your teammates, because individual success means nothing if the team fails." She paused in her cutting and looked directly at the group of servers. "You failed as a team because you allowed personal prejudices to override professional judgment. You created a hostile work environment that hurt not just me, but the entire restaurant's performance." Chef Rodriguez nodded grimly. "She's right. I've noticed that service has been suffering. Ticket times have been inconsistent, and we've had more customer complaints in the past month than in the previous 6 months combined." It was true, though he hadn't connected the dots until now. The toxic atmosphere created by the harassment campaign had infected the entire operation, creating stress and dysfunction that had rippled throughout the restaurant's performance. "Real leadership," Sarah continued, "means creating an environment where everyone can perform at their best. It means judging people by their contributions, not their appearance. It means having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular." She set down the knife and faced the dining room. "I want to apologize to all of you for the disruption to your evening. You came here for a pleasant dining experience, and instead you've been subjected to workplace drama. That should never have reached this point." Several customers immediately protested, insisting that no apology was necessary and that they were honored to witness her grace under pressure. But Sarah wasn't finished with her lesson. "The real tragedy here," she said, "is that this could have been avoided entirely. If you had approached me with genuine curiosity instead of prejudicial assumptions, you might have learned something valuable. I would have been happy to share my experiences, my training, and my knowledge with any of you who showed interest. She gestured to her scars again, but now they seemed to glow with pride rather than shame. These marks represent not just my journey, but the opportunities for growth and learning that you missed because you were too busy judging the surface to look at what lay beneath. Diego nodded approvingly. In my 40 years in kitchens, I've learned that the best cooks often have the most scars. They're the ones who weren't afraid to take risks, to push themselves, to learn from their mistakes. The elderly prep cooks. Words carried the weight of decades of experience, and they served as a perfect counterpoint to the shallow judgments that had driven the harassment campaign. Sarah's lesson in leadership was having its intended effect. The dining room had become an impromptu classroom, and everyone present was learning something valuable about courage, integrity, and the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their appearance. But the most important lesson was still to come. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as Sarah surveyed the faces around her. She had successfully defended herself, exposed the shallow cruelty of her tormentors, and demonstrated her exceptional qualifications to everyone present. But now came the most important decision of the evening: what to do next. Chef Rodriguez stepped forward, his face etched with genuine remorse. "Sarah, I can't begin to express how sorry I am about what you've endured here. I should have been more aware, more involved in the day-to-day dynamics of my kitchen. This is my failure as much as anyone's." He turned to face Jessica Marcus and the other servers who had participated in the harassment campaign. "As for the rest of you, your behavior has been absolutely unacceptable. You've created a hostile work environment, engaged in systematic harassment, and brought shame on this establishment. I'm terminating all of you, effective immediately." The announcement sent shockwaves through the group. Jessica's face went white as the full consequences of her actions finally hit home. "Chef, please, you can't just—" "I can and I will," Rodriguez interrupted firmly. "Your actions tonight weren't just cruel, they were illegal. You've created liability for this restaurant that could have destroyed us. More importantly, you've shown that you lack the basic human decency required to work in any professional environment." Marcus tried to object, his voice rising with desperation. "This isn't fair. We were just trying to maintain standards." "Whose standards?" Colonel Morrison interjected from across the room. "Because the standards I learned in 30 years of military service tell me that what you did to this woman was cowardly, dishonorable, and beneath contempt." The colonel's intervention carried enormous weight with the other customers in the restaurant. Here was a man whose own credentials were unquestionable, publicly condemning the behavior they had all witnessed. But Sarah raised her hand for silence, and the room immediately complied. Despite everything that had happened, she still commanded the attention and respect of everyone present. "Chef Rodriguez," she said quietly, "I appreciate your support, but I need to make something clear. I didn't reveal my background to save my job or to get revenge on these people. I did it because I wanted everyone here to understand something important about the assumptions we make about others." She walked over to where Jessica was standing, tears now streaming down the former hostess's face. Instead of triumph or anger, Sarah's expression showed something unexpected: compassion. "Jessica," she said gently, "do you understand what you did wrong?" Jessica nodded, unable to speak through her tears. "Tell me," Sarah prompted, her voice still gentle but firm. I judged you without knowing anything about you," Jessica managed to whisper. "I was cruel and petty, and I led others to be cruel too. I'm so sorry." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's a start. But the real question is, what are you going to do differently in the future?" The question caught everyone off guard. Instead of simply accepting the apologies and watching her tormentors face consequences, Sarah was trying to turn this into a teachable moment, an opportunity for genuine growth and change. "I don't know," Jessica admitted. "I've never had to think about it before. I just assumed that the way I saw things was right." "That's the problem," Sarah replied. "Assumptions are dangerous. They close our minds to possibilities and prevent us from seeing the truth about people and situations." She turned to address the entire room. "I have a choice to make now. I can accept Chef Rodriguez's offer to fire these people, or I can try to turn this into something positive, a learning experience that might prevent this from happening to someone else." The restaurant was completely silent as everyone waited to hear what she would decide. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen. "I've spent 8 years in the military fighting for American values like forgiveness, second chances, and the belief that people can change if they're willing to do the work," Sarah continued. "If I simply watch these people get fired, what does that accomplish? They'll go to other jobs and might repeat the same behavior with someone who doesn't have my training or confidence." Michael Chun, the tech billionaire, spoke up from his table. "With respect, Ms. Martinez, some behavior is unforgivable. These people created a hostile work environment and engaged in systematic harassment. There have to be consequences." Sarah nodded. "You're absolutely right about consequences. But consequences don't always have to be purely punitive. Sometimes the most effective consequences are the ones that create opportunities for growth and learning." She looked at each of the servers in turn. "Here's what I propose. Instead of firing you, Chef Rodriguez could put you all on probation. You would attend sensitivity training, participate in team-building exercises, and work under close supervision for the next 6 months. Any repeat of this behavior would result in immediate termination." Chef Rodriguez looked skeptical. "Sarah, after what they put you through, why would you want to work alongside them?" "Because," Sarah replied, "running away from difficult situations isn't what SEALs do. We face challenges head-on and find ways to turn obstacles into opportunities. If these people are willing to do the hard work of examining their behavior and changing it, then this restaurant could become a model for how to handle workplace conflicts constructively." It was an extraordinary offer, one that demonstrated the kind of leadership and character that had made Sarah successful in the calloused military. But would her tormentors be mature enough to accept it? The silence stretched on as everyone in the restaurant processed Sarah's unexpected proposal. Instead of revenge or vindication, she was offering her tormentors something far more valuable, a chance at redemption. But redemption always comes with a price, and everyone understood that this offer came with serious conditions. Jessica was the first to respond, her voice still shaky from the emotional weight of the confrontation. You would really give us another chance? After everything we did to you?" "I would give you the opportunity to earn another chance," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and trust has to be rebuilt through consistent actions over time." Marcus stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "What would we have to do?" Sarah's expression remained serious. "First, you would each write a formal apology, not just to me, but to everyone in this restaurant who witnessed your behavior tonight. You would acknowledge specifically what you did wrong and commit to changing those behaviors." She began pacing slowly. As she outlined her conditions, her military bearing evident in every movement. "Second, you would attend monthly sensitivity training sessions for the next year, at your own expense. This isn't about political correctness. It's about learning to see people as individuals rather than collections of superficial characteristics." Chef Rodriguez was listening intently, and Sarah could see him beginning to understand the wisdom of her approach. This wasn't just about resolving the immediate conflict. It was about creating a better workplace culture for everyone. "Third," Sarah continued, "you would participate in community service focused on supporting veterans. I want you to spend time with people who have served to understand what sacrifice really looks like. Maybe then you'll develop some perspective on what matters and what doesn't. The conditions were demanding but fair. They required genuine effort, personal growth, and a commitment to understanding the experiences of others. Most importantly, they offered a path forward that could benefit everyone involved. Colonel Morrison nodded approvingly. Those are reasonable terms. The question is whether these individuals have the character to live up to them. Trevor, the sommelier, who had been one of Sarah's most vocal critics, spoke up hesitantly. And if we agree to these terms, you'd stay? You'd continue working here? That depends, Sarah replied. Not just on whether you agree to the terms, but on whether you actually follow through on them. Words are easy, it's actions that count. Mrs. Patterson from the Times had been taking notes throughout the entire confrontation, recognizing that she was witnessing something extraordinary. Ms. Martinez, what you're proposing is remarkable. In my 20 years of covering the restaurant industry, I've never seen anyone handle a situation like this with such grace and wisdom. The food critic's endorsement carried significant weight in the room. If the Times was going to cover this story, and it was clear that they were, Sarah's handling of the situation would be presented as a masterclass in leadership and conflict. Resolution. Michael Chun stood up from his table and approached Sarah. Ms. Martinez, my offer of employment still stands. What you've demonstrated tonight, your leadership, your character, your ability to turn conflict into opportunity, those are exactly the qualities my organization values most. Sarah smiled and accepted his business card. Thank you, Mr. Chun. I'll definitely consider your offer. But right now, I have a decision to make about whether to stay here and see if this experiment in workplace transformation can succeed. She turned back to the group of servers, studying each face carefully. So what's it going to be? Are you willing to do the hard work of changing, or would you prefer to just move on to your next jobs and hope this kind of situation doesn't happen again? One by one, each of the servers agreed to Sarah's terms. Some seemed genuinely remorseful and eager to make amends, while others appeared motivated more by the desire to avoid unemployment than by any real commitment to personal growth. But Sarah had expected that change was always a process, and motivation could evolve over time. Chef Rodriguez extended his hand to Sarah. Would you be willing to stay on as our headline cook? And not just because of what happened tonight, because of the exceptional work you've been doing for months that I was too busy to properly acknowledge. Sarah shook his hand firmly. I'll stay, but with some conditions of my own. I want to be involved in hiring decisions for kitchen staff, and I want regular team meetings where we can address issues before they escalate to this level. Done, Rodriguez agreed immediately. And I want you to know that your military service and your exceptional qualifications will be properly recognized. No more hiding your accomplishments. As the evening wound down and customers began to leave, many stopped to shake Sarah's hand and thank her for her service. The story of what had happened would spread throughout New York's restaurant community within days, but the narrative would be one of courage, leadership, and the power of second chances. Diego, the elderly prep cook, approached Sarah as she began cleaning her station. That was well done, Mia, he said quietly. You showed them what real strength looks like. Sarah smiled and nodded. We'll see if they learned anything from it. The test of her decision wouldn't come from this dramatic confrontation, but from the daily interactions and gradual changes in workplace culture that would follow. She had chosen the harder path, the one that required faith in people's capacity for growth and change. But then again, Navy SEALs had never been known for taking the easy way out. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.